From the moment I accepted the dare, a chill unlike any other crept into my bones. I still remember the bitter wind that swept across the barren landscape, carrying murmurs of long-forgotten secrets. The path to Blackwood Asylum was shrouded in mist and despair, and the sky, an oppressive canopy of bruised purples and ashen grays, seemed to warn me of the impending doom. I had often boasted about my nerve for adventure, yet nothing could have prepared me for the palpable malevolence that emanated from that crumbling edifice. Every step I took toward the derelict iron gate, rusted and hanging on by a thread, felt like trespassing into a realm where the living were unwelcome. I recalled the whispered legends of vengeful spirits and tormented souls condemned to wander its decaying corridors. Doubt clawed at my mind, yet the lure of capturing a ghostly encounter on camera and the need to prove my courage overrode every instinct of self-preservation. My heart pounded in my chest as I advanced. Each creak of the ancient door, each rustle in the dead leaves at my feet, echoed like the distant cries of those long silenced by suffering. I paused at the threshold, taking in every detail, the splintered wood, the peeling paint stained by time and neglect, and the scent of decay that permeated the air. The stories of unspeakable experiments, of lost lives and anguished wails, surged in my thoughts. A cold sweat broke out on my skin as I recalled the warnings: don't cross the line, some places are meant to remain forgotten. And yet, as I checked my camera, battery full, lens glistening with anticipation, I stepped forward, determined to face whatever horrors lurked inside. The wind howled around me as if echoing the screams of the past. Shadows danced in the periphery of my vision, and every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet seemed to whisper an ominous prelude to the terror that was about to unfold. I felt simultaneously drawn and repelled by the grim history embedded in every crack of the asylum's facade. The heavy atmosphere pressed in on me, each second stretching into an eternity of dread and uncertain promise. I moved cautiously into the darkness, each footfall measured and deliberate. The corridor ahead was cloaked in gloom, lit only by the weak beam of my flashlight that flickered like a dying ember. The walls, scarred by time and neglect, told silent stories of agony and despair. I could almost hear the muffled sobs of those who had once walked these halls, a requiem for souls trapped between life and death. In that moment, as I crossed the threshold of Blackwood Asylum, I realized that some challenges come at a price far higher than one can imagine. A lesson I was about to learn in the most harrowing way possible. A deep sense of foreboding enveloped me as I pressed onward, every fiber of my being screaming to turn back. Yet, the need to document the unknown urged me further into the abyss. The ancient stones beneath my feet bore the scars of countless tragedies, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the distant, almost inaudible creaks of a building that seemed very much alive. Memories of childhood tales about haunted places resurfaced, each story now real and tangible in the cold night air. I wondered if fate had orchestrated this moment for a reason, setting me on a collision course with the dark secrets that lay hidden behind each decaying wall. Even as terror bubbled within, a strange exhilaration took hold, a perverse thrill in confronting the unknown. I could not yet fathom that my journey into Blackwood Asylum would become a descent into madness, where the line between reality and nightmare would blur into oblivion. Every step forward was a step into a living nightmare, where the echoes of the past intertwined with the present in a macabre dance of horror and despair. In that charged silence, my resolve wavered, but my determination never faltered. I was now irrevocably bound to the fate of this forsaken place, and as the darkness swallowed me whole, I braced myself for the terrors that awaited beyond the next threshold. In the heavy gloom, time seemed to slow as I ventured deeper into the asylum. The air grew colder, each exhale forming a fleeting mist that vanished into the oppressive darkness. With every heartbeat, the building's sinister pulse grew louder, as if it were aware of my intrusion. I could feel its ancient presence, a malignant force that would not let me leave without a toll. And so, with trembling hands and a racing mind, I continued onward, into the unknown, where every shadow promised a secret, and every silence was a harbinger of the horrors yet to come. No sooner had I stepped past the entryway than the atmosphere shifted. The cold that filled the corridors was not merely the absence of heat, It was as if the very walls exhaled an icy dread, swallowing every trace of warmth. My flashlight beam trembled over a long, damp corridor where the water-stained ceiling sagged under the relentless assault of decay. Here, the remnants of what once might have been opulence lay in ruins: chipped plaster, splintered wood, and the ghostly imprint of memories too painful to recall. To my left, a reception desk, long abandoned and forgotten, stood as a relic of a more civilized past. Its surface was etched with the scars of time, dust motes swirling in the stale air, and scattered papers hinting at hurried, desperate lives. An ancient monitor, its screen shattered and its body marred by burn marks, lay discarded on the cold floor, an eerie monument to a forgotten era of torment and suffering. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, I saw it. Behind the desk, a wheelchair faced away from me. In a moment that defied rational explanation, it shifted, slowly, deliberately, as if animated by a will of its own. My breath caught in my throat. Was it a trick of the failing light or something far more sinister? The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the echo of my own rapid heartbeat. I stood frozen in that moment of disbelief, my mind scrambling for logical explanations. Perhaps it was the wind, a stray draft, but the corridor was sealed tight against any outside influence. A creeping dread began to take root as I cautiously advanced, each step punctuated by the soft, hollow sound of my footsteps on the cracked tile. The walls were lined with portraits of bygone eras, faded images of patients and doctors whose eyes, though blurred by time, seemed to follow my every move. In those eyes, I could almost discern a silent plea, a desperate warning etched into the very fabric of their existence. Then came the sound from upstairs, a faint scraping noise that echoed like the dragging of chains across cold stone. It was a sound so subtle, yet so utterly out of place in the oppressive silence that it sent a shudder down my spine. My gaze darted to the grand staircase that led into the murky darkness above. The steps, worn smooth by decades of use, disappeared into a void where light dared not intrude. Every instinct screamed for me to retreat, yet a morbid curiosity compelled me forward. I began my ascent with cautious, trembling steps. The staircase seemed to groan under my weight, its ancient timbers protesting my intrusion. As I climbed, the scraping sound grew louder, a dissonant chorus that blended with the creaks of the old wood and the distant whispers of long-dead souls. Shadows shifted in the periphery, morphing into grotesque shapes that danced along the walls. The oppressive atmosphere tightened its grip around my heart, and I could feel the relentless pull of unseen eyes scrutinizing my every move. The upper landing was cloaked in an eerie half-light, the beam of my flashlight barely penetrating the thick darkness. Each doorway I passed revealed fragments of decay and despair, torn draperies, broken mirrors, and remnants of personal belongings left to fester in abandonment. The silence here was nearly tangible, a heavy, suffocating presence that seemed to murmur secrets in a language older than time itself. I could sense the weight of every sorrow, every lost hope that had seeped into the very stones of this forsaken place. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere made me pause. I felt that I was being watched not by one single entity, but by an entire legion of unseen specters. The eyes in the portraits appeared to burn with a quiet malevolence, and the oppressive silence was punctuated by fleeting sounds, a whisper of fabric, a soft rustle in the dark. My mind raced with questions. Who or what had once occupied this place? What secrets did these walls hold? And most terrifying of all, had I just awakened something that should have remained undisturbed? With each step deeper into the asylum, the line between reality and nightmare began to blur. The light of my flashlight wavered, casting trembling shadows that seemed to twist and writhe with a life of their own. I could almost feel the presence of those who had been lost here, their stories etched into the very decay that surrounded me. Every echo, every whisper, beckoned me further into the abyss of despair. As I reached the end of the corridor, the sound of scraping transformed into a low, mournful wail, a sound that resonated with the sorrow of countless souls condemned to suffer in eternal silence. Driven by equal parts terror and a desperate need to understand, I pressed onward. The oppressive gloom was broken only by the fragile beam of my light, which danced uncertainly over crumbling walls and broken relics of a time when hope still dared to exist. In that fragile moment, I realized that the first signs of horror were not the sudden apparitions or blood-curdling screams, but the slow, insidious accumulation of dread, a realization that would haunt me in the moments to come. A sudden shift in the oppressive gloom made my blood run cold. As I navigated a narrow, decrepit hallway on the upper floor, the beam of my flashlight began to falter. For an instant, The corridor was swallowed by darkness before the light sputtered back to life, only to reveal a presence that froze my very soul. At the far end of the passage stood a figure so unnaturally tall and gaunt that it defied all reason. Its elongated arms hung limply at its sides, and where eyes should have resided, there were only cavernous voids that seemed to devour every flicker of light. Time itself appeared to slow. Every nerve in my body screamed in silent terror as I stared at that ghastly apparition. It did not move, it simply stood there, an embodiment of the nightmares that had haunted my every step since I first crossed the threshold of Blackwood Asylum. The figure's presence was overwhelming. Its inhuman stillness radiated a cold, calculated malevolence that seemed to pierce the very fabric of my being. In that suffocating moment, a voice, low, distorted, and filled with an ancient sorrow, whispered my name from the depths of the darkness. "You can't escape who you are." Those words, echoing with an otherworldly finality, shattered any remnants of rational thought. My legs, as if possessed by an unseen force, betrayed me by refusing to carry me any further. The realization struck with brutal clarity: I was not merely an intruder in this forsaken place. I was its latest captive, destined to suffer the same fate as those whose agony still lingered in every decaying corner. Panic surged through me as I attempted to flee, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm that drowned out even the oppressive silence of the corridor. The walls seemed to close in, their surfaces alive with twisted shadows that reached out like grasping hands. The very air vibrated with the echoes of a past filled with torment and retribution, and I knew in that moment that Blackwood Asylum was not done with me yet. Every instinct screamed to run, yet the heavy gravity of the building's curse rooted me to the spot. I tried to back away, but the path I had taken appeared to have changed. The hall, once a familiar passageway of decay, now twisted into an endless labyrinth. Doors that had been securely closed now lay ajar as if some unseen force had swept through, leaving a trail of despair in its wake. The oppressive silence was broken only by the echo of my frantic breathing and the slow, deliberate sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The figure at the end of the corridor remained motionless, its gaze, or the absence thereof, seemingly fixed upon me. With every passing second, I felt its influence tightening around my mind, urging me to confront the inescapable truth of my destiny. Memories of childhood nightmares, of shadowy figures lurking just beyond the edges of my vision, surged forth with relentless intensity. I realized that this horrifying specter was not an isolated manifestation but rather the embodiment of every fear I had ever suppressed, the darkness within me given form by the malignant energy of the asylum. As I struggled to break free of the paralyzing grip of terror, the corridor's temperature plummeted further. My flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic patterns on the warped walls that seemed to writhe in response. In a final desperate bid to escape the crushing weight of fate, I turned to run, but my body refused to obey. The spectral figure advanced imperceptibly closer, and in that moment, I felt an icy hand of destiny close around my heart. The whispered words, laden with an otherworldly authority, echoed once more, a final proclamation of my inescapable doom. Locked in that eternal moment of horror, I surrendered to the realization that there was no escape. Blackwood Asylum had claimed me as it had claimed so many before. The darkness, the silence, and the unspeakable presence that stalked its halls had merged with my very soul. In that instance of paralyzing dread, I understood that my fate was sealed. I was now a part of the asylum's endless, tortured legacy, doomed to wander its corridors for all eternity. When I next opened my eyes, harsh, flickering fluorescent light assaulted my vision, and a disorienting buzz filled the air. The reality that greeted me was more nightmarish than any specter that had haunted my journey thus far. I found myself strapped to a cold, metal table by thick leather restraints that bit into my wrists and ankles with unyielding pressure. The sterile room, illuminated by the erratic pulse of failing lights, exuded an aura of clinical horror, an environment where pain and despair had been meticulously engineered. Muffled voices drifted through the air, their tones a grotesque parody of compassion. In the center of the room stood a figure whose presence was both familiar and chilling. A doctor, his features twisted into a semblance of detached amusement as he held a file that bore the unmistakable seal of Blackwood Asylum. His smile was unervingly calm, as if he reveled in the suffering of his patient. "Patient 237? The treatment begins now," he intoned, his voice resonating with a cold, clinical finality that sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through me. In that moment, every horror I had encountered coalesced into a singular, crushing realization. I was not merely a trespasser in this cursed place. I had become an integral part of its dark experiments. The memories of the asylum's tortured past, the unspeakable experiments, and the specters that had haunted my every step now converged in a singular, unbearable truth. The doctor's words reverberated in my mind like the tolling of a death knell, sealing my fate as another lost soul consigned to the endless torment of Blackwood Asylum. As the realization sank in, the room seemed to shift and warp around me. The fluorescent light flickered erratically, its unstable glow transforming the sterile surroundings into a nightmarish landscape of shadows and shifting forms. The leather restraints dug deeper into my skin, a constant reminder of the inescapable bond between myself and this unholy place. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out the muted sounds of the doctor's measured breathing and the soft, rhythmic beeping of machinery hidden in the recesses of the room. I strained against my bonds, desperate to break free from the physical and psychological prison that had been imposed upon me. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest as I attempted to wriggle free, but it was all in vain. The oppressive weight of fate bore down upon me, as inescapable as the darkness that had engulfed every corner of this forsaken institution. The doctor's eyes, cold and devoid of empathy, remained locked on me, a silent promise that my suffering was only just beginning. Around me, the room seemed to pulsate with a sinister life of its own. Shadows danced in unnatural patterns across the walls, their forms merging and splitting as if reflecting the tortured fragments of my shattered mind. Every detail, the smell of antiseptic tainted with decay, the incessant hum of machinery, the chill that seeped into my very soul, spoke of a horror meticulously designed to break the spirit and obliterate the will to resist. In that harrowing moment, as the first sharp pangs of pain began to radiate from the sights of the restraints, I understood that there was no escape from this fate. Blackwood Asylum had claimed me completely. The legacy of suffering, of experimental cruelty and lost humanity, was now my reality. Each breath I drew was a struggle against the overwhelming despair that threatened to drown me. I felt the doctor's presence loom closer, the clinical detachment in his eyes belying the terror he was about to unleash. As I sank into a state of resigned horror, the finality of my situation became inescapable. I was no longer a wanderer seeking thrills in the dark recesses of an abandoned asylum. I had become an unwilling participant in its legacy of agony. With every moment that passed, the final horror of Blackwood Asylum wrapped its tendrils more tightly around me, promising that the treatment and the torment it entailed would last for an eternity. And in that suffocating darkness, with the doctor's words echoing in my mind like a death sentence, I realized that I would never see the light of day again.